Hey, I'm Jacob Cooperman, and you were watching the MMA Conspiracy Hour with Todd Atkins and Miguel Iturrate. Todd has been involved in covering combat sports since the 1990s, and Miguel has match-made over 200 different events amongst various promotions worldwide. Please subscribe and be on the lookout for future episodes. As for me, you can check me out at Gloves Up on YouTube and Coop TV with 3 O's on Instagram. Thank you guys, and enjoy the episode.
All right, this is Todd Atkins, and I'm back with Miguel Iturrate. We're going to do a little MMA Conspiracy Hour, and we've been away a little bit, but back at it again today. And, there are some developments as we've been away. There's been some more developments on this UFC class action trial as to where it just, it seems like the judge is still not budging on the settlement. And it's looking more and more like it's either the UFC is going to have to cough up more money or it's going to go to trial. So I'll read some of these tweets later, but I wanted to give Miguel a chance to kind of just start with your opening kind of thoughts on this.
Well, a few months ago when they announced the settlement, our first instinct was that the money was low. And as more details came out and you heard that, almost the entire second class of the lawsuit, or a lot of those guys were going to wind up with about $5,000 each. You do start to wonder what was going on there. Again, the lawyers were going to take a huge part of the fees. They get 30% probably. So that was going to leave a lot less money for that. But the lawyers also have been carrying this, pro bono or with, working on the expenses, covering the expenses for whatever investigations or, going through the emails and things like that. And that could be one of the reasons why they've grown weary of and were willing to accept the lawsuit. The fighters are probably sitting at home also sitting there thinking it's been years. When are we going to get some money? So, probably guys on the lower end of the spectrum weren't going to be happy, but guys that are going to do a big, decent chunk of money there probably wanted it. And the lawyers probably wanted to be finished with it and move on with their lives. One of the interesting things I remember also that Maisie said, and this was our first interview with him, where I talked to him about, T-shirt companies, newspapers, like Full Contact Fighter, and businesses that were around the periphery of the sport, or, they were an integral part of the sport. I guess periphery wouldn't be the right. They were an integral part of the sport, and those guys were making money. And because of some of the UFC's behavior, those guys are not in business anymore. And he, I think, said that though those guys may also have a grievance against the UFC, that they're not part of this lawsuit. This lawsuit was just the fighters. So what would be interesting to me is so the judge decides that this is going to go to court, and that'll probably still play itself out relatively quickly. And talked about fast tracking a jury, trial by jury and things like that. So yeah, the UFC will go through that, and they'll have to turn over more money than they've gotten there, and that likelihood will be done quickly. And then there's appeals if the UFC loses and things like that. If the UFC wins, and nobody gets anything, I guess, right? But what would be interesting to me is the judge. The reason I brought up guys like Full Contact Fighter and things like that, and that Maisie had said they're not part of this lawsuit, it's just the fighters, and also after 10 years. I believe part of what we saw here is that the legal team was weary. What would be interesting to me would be for the judge to say, look, pay attention to this trial that's coming up, because this company's been operating a monopoly, and a monopoly needs to be broken up by some type of federal agency. I don't know if it's the FBI or the Treasury Department or somebody who has to launch a much bigger investigation in which case, they're going through the books. They're looking at the behavior of all the money that was going on and how much are they really taking in. If they can give out $1 million bonuses 10 years ago, then how much money have they been taking in? And they were a publicly traded company for a while, but for a while they weren't. A long time they weren't. And nobody knows the real answer to that. And I think that these lawyers in the current lawsuit saw that as a black hole, 20 years worth of books that you got to look at. And, at some point there's a statute of limitation there, but a Treasury investigation into their books and finances is what really could force them to change their business practices. We in the preparatory, we mentioned, and also Maisie mentioned that a lot of the fighters in the second portion of the lawsuit had signed contracts waiving their rights to legal action, that they won't sue the UFC and things like that. And the UFC still probably has that stuff in their contracts, right? So now nobody can sue them now. So what have you been wronging these guys for all along? Now, an investigation there will say, look, looks like they're still paying out about 15% of all the money coming in, and they want to be run like a sport. This is the playing field of the NFL, the NBA, and others say is that the money is usually 50-50. And you don't see too many poor NBA owners, so it's not like 50-50. The extra money that the UFC is making off of this is going right into the pockets of Dana, Ari. All these guys are making boatloads off the back of the fighters still. And they couched it, always since the beginning, some of that behavior was them coming in and bonusing people. They started out with small bonuses, but hey, it was a great PR tool from the beginning till now. And they increase it, but it doesn't answer the question, how much money are they really making? And I think that maybe I don't know if it's the Treasury, but now once you have a government agency there, Bob Mazie, God bless these guys in his law team. He's got a legal team. He's got to chop up whatever money they're going to get for it. And they've been working for 10 years and blah, blah, blah. But you may need hundreds of accountants to start going through emails and paperwork and tax filings and all kinds of different angles on there. And I don't think the legal team for this lawsuit was prepared to do all the work. Like they referred to some work was done. Obviously, they had come across the famous Joe Silva email, which is still one of the things that's talked about in that lawsuit. But what about other emails that may not have been reviewed that certainly should reveal the true extent of what the UFC has been doing? Again, I don't think they've been careful, especially back in the old days. At some point, you heard, that, whatever, agencies record every email, record every phone call, everything that's done in the United States and stuff. Well, what's the good of recording that stuff if no one's going to go through it? Now, if those records are there, a big investigation from the federal government could go into all those details and really find that the UFC is performing the practices of a monopoly and crush competition.
I want to ask you this,
and I don't think, I think that this trial and the judge, he'll take it to jury trial. The UFC will pay. They'll continue doing what they want. They'll appeal if they lose. But if this judge is actually notifying, I'm guessing it's the FBI or the Treasury Department or somebody about these types of practices that could be going on here, and that warrants a bigger and further stronger investigation than the ones that's been going on, then we're looking at years, but that would be the true start of the UFC changing their business practices. I don't think that the UFC in any way, shape, or form, at the end of the day here, maybe the judge and the jury in their settlement of this could ask for some business practice changes. But again, with the appeals and things like that, and there's still going to be stuff left on the table. you know, hiring other people's business executives, in good faith, in bad faith, rather, negotiating with fighters under contract to other companies, who knows what other types of problems they've been doing for a long time, back from the old days that led them to be as big and as powerful as they are now. So I think it's going to take, and again, there's going to be like some type of limitation, right? There were a lot of fighters from the old days who weren't going to get any money because it was too long ago from this lawsuit. But if a decision is made to examine and attack them from the monopoly end, then there may be some way, at least you can look at the evidence, even if there's no, financial relief for the victims. The evidence will be there that these guys operated in a way that was meant to absolutely crush competition, for them to be the only game in town.
Let me ask you this, knowing what you know, as long as you've been around, and I think we both agree, as do most people, that the UFC probably, they've been acting in bad faith and that they are guilty of antitrust violations. What do you think is their motivation to settle versus going to trial?
Well, trial is a risk. Trial is a risk because if they get found guilty, then the reward will be a lot higher. And there is a potential, there was always a potential, Bob Mazy had mentioned it, even in this trial, that they would be asked to change some of their business practices. Now, again, a full investigation of all their activities going back, like, for example, one of the people, we mentioned newspapers and magazine companies and T-shirt companies and sponsors and everybody who the UFC just destroyed. I guess one of the other examples is the case of Monty Cox, where the UFC took the premier manager in the business, who, love him or hate him, and some of his fighters still love him. Some of his fighters don't communicate with him. Monty can be controversial at times. Monty was never shy. He's honest, and he was never shy about saying, he liked to make his money too. He didn't give, in part, but what the UFC did was go to guys that he had under contract and try to actively break that contract with them by slipping them money. And the way that was done is we, have covered a few times is that, Monty's supposed to, how do you interpret Monty's contract with the fighters? In some of the early cases, this is probably a verbal contract too. It makes it even more difficult. But it's like, hey, I get 20% of all fight earnings. Okay. So, some of the guys were like Tim Sylvia was making 100 G's, for his UFC fights, 100 and 100. So, and he was winning some of them. So Monty got $40,000 from Tim Sylvia. I interviewed Tim Sylvia about 6 months ago with Monty. So Tim didn't have a problem with that. But some fighters, once those purses started going up, and Monty, in the case of Matt Hughes, who I don't think he talks to, and Matt had his catastrophic health problem with a train wreck that he's not out in public much anymore and everything like that. But I've heard that they bonused him millions, and that the conversation was there to tell them, you shouldn't give Monty any of that money because it's a bonus. It's not based on anything he negotiated. He didn't work on it. It just kind of came from out of the blue. And that became a sticking point with a good portion of Monty's fighters. I remember, I'm not sure if it was Brian Stand. At some point, Monty's tendrils were deep and all over the place. Anybody with talent that came through his shows, he would, try to get signed up for a contract. I think it was Brian Stand that would say, hey, Monty, we got a performance bonus. Not everybody cared about it. They would give Monty their money.
No, it was Rich
Monty
Franklin. It's the one he had mentioned.
Okay, and Franklin's another guy he still has a good relationship with, but there was that particular story where the guy would call him up and be like, hey, we got a bonus. It wasn't Franklin. It was one of the other middleweights. But And it might be Brian Stanley, it might not be, but yeah, then there's the example of Josh Neer. When Josh, an outstanding UFC performer, started getting those bonus checks, he didn't want to give the money to Monty. He's like, Monty, this isn't in the contract. You didn't negotiate this money for me or anything like that. It's based on my performance. Monty, you didn't really do anything. That was his logic. So the fighters were split, and Monty at some point had to start getting rid of fighters that wouldn't meet that, because you can't have some people working one contract and some people working the other in terms of business. So does Monty have a grievance? And I bet you a real true examination of emails and things, that the effort, and Monty was a guy, like I said, the energy and extreme level of what Monty did in the early days of the sport, including running hundreds of shows. I think he's back to running shows now, but managing some fighters, but not in the UFC. The UFC actively wanted him gone. And another one of the stories that you always heard, I think Monty tells this one in his book as well, is that he was at a UFC, and this was back in the early days of Zuffa. Dana's not yet in full control. He's still learning the game, And Joe Silva was a little bit more forthcoming in front, and he had a good relationship with Monty. They could joke with each other. And Joe said something, and Monty, I think of the 8 fights they had on the show, Monty had guys in 6 of them. So Monty made a joke and said, hey, what if I just pull my guys? He never did anything like that. Monty would do certain things. Like I know he ran a show on the same day in the same town as another promoter he didn't like and things like that. He had an ability to flex, but he wasn't going to, do the UFC wrong like that, but he joked about it, and they didn't like that possibility at all. And it was from there that they said, we can never have anybody have that much power. So, Monty, again, worked in Japan and took guys over there. And back in the early days of Zuffa, there were more options for fighters. You could go to Japan and make a decent payday. You could find a show here or there. One of the things that Monty did, for example, with guys like Jeff Curry and things like that, was run shows in conjunction with them as a co-promoter. So he would help with his, ability to get fighters, covering fighters, and getting them active. And the fighters would make extra money off of the promotion of the shows as well. But slowly but surely, the UFC took away, I don't know how many guys in the UFC now are managed by Monty. Probably none. So is there a grievance there on his part, where they looks like there could be proof there that they worked, didn't just happen by chance, that they wanted him gone? And would that be something that, Monty at this point, I don't know if it's going to be a separate lawsuit or anything like that. Monty, I think has moved on. But that type of activity at every level, because there are other managers like that, similar now. Now the whole management structure is you get signed by a company that works directly with the matchmakers. And if you're not with those companies, you're really not going to get into the UFC. So they're all kind of like front companies or something,
Front managers, yeah, for sure.
So they took away the natural management system that has springed up, of which Monty is obviously the strongest, but there were other guys. TJ Thompson liked to manage his guys. Other promoters like to do that. I in particular didn't do that. That wasn't the way they were going to hit me, but they could always overpay or outpay me. So the competition for fighters was difficult. I still think that the Bodog roster at that point, where I did have a good budget, I still think that was the most dangerous roster they faced. That was a roster of getting to be close to 200 fighters that were quality, where you could take a few of the guys from there. Eddie Alvarez went on to become a champion for them. Cain Velasquez went on to become a champion for them. They made stars of a lot of our guys. I usually mention Masvidal and Chael, but there were a lot of guys. Roy Nelson had a peak in the sport too, where he didn't make a championship level, but he certainly made money with the UFC. Roy Nelson was one of our fighters. They took a lot of guys from our roster. Kind of well documented that Joe Silva didn't like Trevor Prangley, but hey, Trevor owns wins over Chael Sonnen. In his heyday, you could have put Trevor in with anybody in the world. And so I think still to this day, that was the most dangerous roster they faced. And what our story is we couldn't get on pay-per-view at one point, and later we're told that one of the executives that handled our earlier pay-per-views was now working as a UFC employee. The emails would reveal if that just happened by chance. Oh, look, we've got a qualified person here. Oh, they worked over there. Oh, you've got, or if they actually went after, who you call the cable company, find out who's working on it, get some inside information, make them an offer, have the person stonewall us and not call us. The emails, the communication should reveal if that theory of mine is actually what happened, or like I said, maybe it was by chance, or maybe it was a story. But everything, the frequency of companies and fighters and stories like that, where you can really actively see the UFC playing a real cutthroat game, whereas, where we come from, there was a certain amount of cutthroat and competition, but that's what it was. It was competition, Me and Monty, hook and shoot in the Extreme Challenge, we shared fighters, but we were rivals. He would call me up, and if he was doing a big show or a good show, he'd be proud of it, and I'd be proud of what we were doing, but we weren't out to kill each other. It was the UFC that came in with the cutthroat game of destroying everybody in every single level of competition. And now with, like, for example, the clothing companies, back in the old days, a fighter could go to a show and have a couple of guys, Eddie Alvarez is a perfect example. I was in Atlantic City promoting Eddie Alvarez's fights, and I started seeing like his brother and people like that literally selling T-shirts out of the back of a van, And technically, I think I owned the rights to his T-shirts and pictures and image, especially around fighting, on our contract. But the kid was used to making money that way, from before he was with us and stuff. So I wasn't going to take that away from him. But the UFC certainly did. You don't see there's no fighter shirts anymore, except nothing with a picture. It's just the name and the T-shirt, and the way Venom has it, and before that it was Reebok. And the only, and the fighters get a bonus on that. Go back to the bonus structure, where the bonus is a game. If you thought I was going to make $100,000 in this fight, and they come up to you with, hey, here's another 40,000 because you're the champion, and you've fought so many times in the UFC that's what your pay scale is, but it's on a scale. So if somebody breaks through, like, how many Khabib shirts could they possibly have sold in Russia? A lot, probably, maybe, and you never know. So they took that. There's another good example of guys that had little sponsors that would put a logo on their shirt or the logo and things like that. And the UFC crushed all of those companies, signed a corporate deal with a company to make their clothes. And of course, that money exchanged, the Reebok deal also seemed low when it started. 77 million, I think it was one of the numbers. It's less than $100 million for a couple of years. And even John Jones was getting, $40,000 as a bonus for wearing the Reebok clothes, And a lot of those guys, I think Rich Franklin's another one of those guys that said, based on this new deal, I'm losing money on sponsors because I can't get the sponsors, cobbled together. Yeah, to a certain extent, Dana's rhetoric makes some sense, right? Now everybody's kind of got a uniform and they look the same and stuff. And you had some, kind of ghetto looking things with when you have 17 sponsor, patches on your shorts and your shirt, and everybody looks different. And at some point, people painted their backs.
Yeah.
So, but all that's gone now. And the Reebok deal, I don't know what basketball players wear Reebok or whatever, but the basketball player deals are all bigger than the UFC's entire deal, which was their first one. And these guys make $100 million. I think this Caitlin Clark girl got 30 million just recently by herself. And then 77 million was meant to be distributed throughout the entire UFC roster. And Dana very much said that the company wasn't keeping any of that money. It was all going to the fighters. I wonder if that's the case with Venom. That's probably another business practice that's changed. Is they're probably grabbing a lot of money from the clothing and from the distribution of that type of material that is probably more than 50-50 with the fighters. I don't, again, on a corporate level, everybody estimates that they make about maybe 15% of the money go towards the fighters. So this was just one of those things where, the fighters aren't getting the money that they used to get or would be capable of getting if they could negotiate their own sponsors. And that's a case where, the NFL, you don't see those guys either with their own sponsors or anything like that, but that's why the money's distributed fairly there, or at least as fairly as possible. And every few years, their collective bargaining agreements change and they negotiate and they work on that. You have none of that structure with the UFC. UFC does what they want.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted
It'll be
to read some of these tweets and maybe have you react to certain ones, because Josh Gross, I want to credit him. Obviously, he's a guy from the old school. Some of any of you new school guys listening may not know who he is, but he was big, really big back in the day, and he's always been one of the guys that was covering sport pretty much from the beginning, well before people like Ariel Helwani were. And I just want to read some of his tweets. So maybe the first one, his first concern, the judge, that is, Judge Boulware in this case. Conflict between the class, he said, Lee was focused on money as to where the Johnson class was focused on injunctive relief, contractual changes and whatnot. And he had a problem between there being different, maybe goals between these two classes. Maybe talk about that a little bit.
Well, probably, some of that has to do with timing, and some also has to do with the fact that in this, the UFC applied certain protections to their new contracts that made them change over time. So the second class, the majority of those guys did have a clause that they signed that said, "Hey, look, when we can't sue the UFC anymore." That wasn't in there before, but now the lawsuit comes and every fighter has to sign that, and that's what was used as, since the settlement, that's what was used as a limiting factor. Was like, okay, the guys that signed that 5,000, and that's that. I can see again, this is one of those things where I think you do need a Treasury Department or an FBI investigation or something like that to truly get to the bottom of it. That an individual lawsuit, even with 1,000 people in the classes, and Maisie, by all accounts, was a hardworking lawyer who took this, for the last 10 years, probably had a good team with him and stuff like that. But they'll be compensated, so it's no big deal. But again, are there things like that? Was it just because? Why the division in classes? Was it because of time, or was it because the contracts changed? Was that, I don't want to say a lazy move, but was it a move that simplified things to get things moving ahead? Because if what you want is a changing of the business practices, I think the UFC is going to dig their heels in. I don't think they want to do that at all. As you mentioned, John Fitch had said, and he's one of the fighters, probably do some money. He said that they don't want anything like regulation. They don't want to be looked at deeply. And, if something could be done where, like I don't know how you investigate monopolies or anything like that, but I would think that now you're talking about a major investigation and major resources that need to be devoted to that. And that's where I think the current lawsuit and the current legal team was short. The UFC and their legal teams and lawyers, again, those guys are all under salary, lawyers and, people that they're paying a lot for the coverage and protection as well. And they're going to have more, I'm sure that the legal teams for the UFC are bigger and stronger than Bob Mazey and his team in terms of resources. In terms of if they needed somebody to go in and review 10 years worth of emails, they could do it. They'll just get the staff and do it, and they've got the money to do it. So I do think that that's one of the things that could be interesting here is if the judge is able to initiate something larger than what the UFC is facing now. And like we said too, we said the UFC, lawsuit or no lawsuit, chance of winning or not winning, we've never seen them sweat over this lawsuit, really. Not in public, not be worried about it, not be like, oh, we'll see what happens. And then just move forward, charge forward. When they got the chance, they threw a couple $100 million at it, and they thought it went away. Something extreme is going to have to happen. But like I said, I don't know if the FBI, the Treasury Department, who would actually look into the scope of their activities over the last, 2 decades.
I could say this, though. I mean, yeah, you had the discovery where you had people like John Nash and people on Twitter going over some of these things. But if they went to trial, there would be a lot more attention placed on these things that have come out. And that might be a reason for UFC not to want to go to trial.
Oh, yeah. No, I think, in trial, they'll be forced to do a lot more work on that. But again, the most notable email that's been discussed is the Joe Silva email where it was in the comments he said, or in the title of the email, he said, "We now own MMA." And this was sometime in the period after they bought Strikeforce and bought all those contracts, and all the top 15 fighters in every weight class were under their contract.
Yep.
But that's really, there should be dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of emails with that level of complicity and guilt.
Right.
And I haven't heard many discussed at all. That's the big one. They may have another couple of examples up their sleeve, but, they certainly haven't talked about them in public. And again, I think you need a major team of resources to go through this stuff with a fine-tooth comb if you're going to actually prove what we suspect, which is that they have operated in bad faith as a monopoly.
Now, I wanted to read a little bit more, maybe two of these here, because they're kind of similar. In that one of the things Judge Boer expressed was address the amount of money awarded to fighters in the settlement and how it is being distributed, especially compared to what fighters could win at trial with treble damages. And also, many of the Johnson class members signed class action antitrust waivers that are now standard in UFC contracts. There is a lot of talk on this issue. Boer is concerned that due to the waiver, many current UFC fighters won't receive a meaningful cash award or changes to the contracts. Go ahead and talk about those.
Yeah, that waiver where they can't sue the UFC. I wonder if, the UFC put in the contract, the fighters have signed it, and it's official. And, but I wonder if anybody's ever challenged it enough to go to court and say, look, I got a feeling this clause here might not even be legal. They may be asking me to waive rights that, you know, a normal person wouldn't waive. Now, when you talk about fighters, you know, they come from different walks of life, all of them. You know what I mean? You have a famous example of BJ Penn, where you kind of know he came from a more or less wealthy family, where, you know, when he had to leave the UFC, they had the resources to run some very good shows in Hawaii, with a lot of top talent. And, you know, eventually he came back to the UFC and things like that. But BJ Penn's family had some resources. The majority of these guys that sign at $3,000, you know, 3,000 back in the day, now 10,000, 10,000, are not from that type of background. I don't know what percentage it is and stuff like that, but, you know, I remember, and I've executed hundreds and hundreds of fighter contracts. And especially when you go back to the older days, you know, and even now, you know, you get I wonder how many guys fighting for 10 and 10 coming up from a smaller show where they were making less money. You know, some of the guys, again, they come from different walks of life, so there's case by case basis. But I would say to you that I would put a good chance that the majority of incoming fighters, maybe half of them, don't even review the contract with a lawyer. Don't even sit, you know, and read it themselves. And if they do read it themselves, I know what they do. They get a 40-page document. They go to the page where it says what they're going to be paid, who they're fighting, and what weight class, and that's what they read. Everything else, all the other nonsense, they don't even know what they're signing away. And the entry-level guys, you know, at some point, John Jones, you know, is sitting there, and they come into him with his first $1 million bonus and stuff. And yeah, at that point, he's got some money for a lawyer. You know, the bigger they become, the more structured they become. Randy Couture was one of the first guys to challenge them, where, you know, Randy's a Hollywood person now, making movies and things like that. So I'm sure that he's, you know, he understood right away. It's like, look, some of the things in the contract that I'm reading there are suspect. Let me get a real lawyer to look at it and confirm what I think. You know, Matt Lindland is another guy. They had lawyers looking at their stuff. But most of the guys, still to this day, I bet you these guys don't have a lawyer. You know, how does a guy like Ilya Tapura, is that the kid's name from the 145-pound champion now?
Yeah.
So he's from Georgia, living in Spain, signing this contract. To even find a lawyer that will understand the full depth of what's being given away and his rights and his, you know, ancillary rights in the States. If I'm not wrong, the minute you sign a UFC contract, let's say, for example, you know, and Conor may be an exception at this point, right? But let's say I wanted to make a movie about Conor McGregor's life before the UFC. Like right up to his UFC debut. So some of his, you know, talk about his early fighting in England, Cage Warriors, and then him coming up in school and, you know, get into some of the other things and just avoid the UFC name, not use it anywhere in the movie. I still can't do that because the UFC owns its rights. And that's what Bob Macy talked about, where it's like, you know, anybody who's going to do a movie or something, you know, more complicated, something with the image of the fighter is going to say, show us the paperwork that you've got with your current employers and your current sponsors and things like that. And the UFC's documents are complicated enough that they must get a phone call. And that's been their strategy all along.
Right.
So like I said, they take advantage of, the fact is nobody's got the legal team that they do. And then on the entry level of the fighters, again, you know, I wasn't with the UFC, but I was working with one, and I got them a couple of fighters with one from Latin America here, including one guy in a title shot and things like that. I don't think that kid took that contract to a lawyer. And he was, and one is in a very extensive contract as well, executed under the laws in Asia. So who knows if it's more or less restrictive than the UFC's. But I present to you that they are familiar with the UFC's contracts and are mirroring them in certain ways so that they aren't also overpaying fight. You know, one doesn't want to come in and overpay. And you know, it's a competition at that level, at the bigger levels. And again, here was a guy in a title fight that I don't think took his contract to a lawyer. I may be wrong, but based on what he was paid for the fight, which was, you know, going to be his first fight for one, there wasn't a lot of extra money there for legal fees.
Yeah, it's I've heard that ones are, you know, just as bad, if not worse. Let's kind of read a little bit more here. Boulware discussed the plaintiff counsel's incentive to settle. He was clear that he wasn't suggesting any wrongdoing. However, he intimated that the push to settle could cost Johnson members twice, leaving them without big money awards or practical legal recourse moving forward. And he also found it difficult to swallow that current fighters might have signed away potential for future litigation in exchange for $3,000, which is what the ones who signed the waiver were set to receive based on the settlement agreement.
It's true. You know,
Yeah.
it's true. Again, it all starts with the one thing that you never hear. You know, you hear the UFC is a machine, and they bombard you with numbers, but a lot of the things that they throw out there also have a masking image. You know, oh, we have a $20 million gate, and it was $3.8 million on a pay-per-view, and how much money did you guys make overall for each show in a year? How much is the total profit of the company? How much are the executives pocketing at the expense of the fighters? Because they want, when it's convenient for them, they want to operate as a sport. And in general, the American sports models, and you know, I'm not sure exactly how it works in soccer, but at the biggest levels of soccer in Europe, especially, those guys make even bigger money than our football and basketball players. So these sports take in money. In the UFC, and in general, they give the fighters, especially at the top level, the players, and especially at the top level, make, you know, life-changing, altering money. There are more people in certain football teams in Europe than just Conor McGregor. Conor McGregor is the only guy who's into the nine figures, really, by most accounts in this sport. You know, John Jones, I guess, may be close, but I think he's screwed up his career and has been inactive at certain peak places that he's probably not at a total of nine figures. A number of basketball players, football players, the sports bring in money. And the UFC is unabashed about, you know, their marketing and their marketing machines and stuff. So again, I think it all starts with a full and legal and complete accounting of how much money they actually are pulling in, how much money they're making. And then if that's the case and you have a dollar figure, you can say, well, let's go ahead and make sure that the fighters and the contracts and the compensation for the actual athletes is about half of what comes in. And that way they've got the other half to run the business and, you know, for all these types of things. But, you know, unless you start with there, then I don't know if we know, you know, and I think that was that's a tall order, and that a full looking into it, like Bob Mazey said. Bob Mazey was at an early UFC where Gerald Strieben got knocked out, and then Gerald was looking to get to borrow money so he can take a bus home to Portland, a bus. And you know, when Bob starts to ask him, you know, he had to pay for his MRI exams and things like that. So the money starts going away quickly. especially at the lower level. And back then he was paid, I think, a couple of $1,000. It was not even 10,000 or whatever. And Bob Macy said the whole lawsuit started because he had been to the show. You know, he talked about guys from other teams and everybody wearing shirts and things, and celebrations, and the number of people that he saw, the number of concessions that he saw, the number of things that are there. It just didn't add up that they could be paying people so low. That's the initiation of the lawsuit, as far as that's what gave that lawyer the interest to say there's something wrong here. And I'm sure that there was more than just, hey, there's 10,000 people here or 12,000, and that's, $100 a seat. And I'm sure it was that they did a lot more work than that. But I don't think that a full accounting of what this company's made in the last 20 years and, is something that this legal team was prepared to be able to do. I think that that's a tall order. I think you do need 100 accountants sitting there with calculators for days, weeks, months, getting things figured out,
Now, here's the last one I thought was kind of interesting. Bulwer floated putting Lee back on trial and lifting the stay on the Johnson litigation to move it forward. The parties could still settle, but as an agreement is written, Bulwer had, let me see here. I think I missed part of it. Get back to this. Let's see. Bulwer. Oh, Bulwer had the disposition of a judge who's very uncomfortable signing off on this.
Yeah, so far, I think that we may have a judge with some, I don't know. I don't know what his motivation is. Maybe he's got a bone to pick with the UFC. He doesn't like them. Maybe he's seeing something and he suspects that something illegal and poor happened there, and he actually wants to act with some ethics and, do the right thing here and not just accept the settlement on both parties and move on. He seems to have some concerns that are the same concerns that we've been expressing here almost from the beginning of the lawsuit, and certainly through the settlement. It starts with the bottom line is the money doesn't add up.
Yeah, I mean, judges aren't stupid. I also think he wants to cover himself because whatever happens, I think he wants to look, I did everything I could. If these people decide to take a low ball settlement, I did everything I could because he knows that they're in violation. These guys know the law better than anybody.
Yeah, and that's the thing is I think that once we heard the numbers, and you heard that fighters were going to get $5,000, that a good part of the second set of fighters on the lawsuit were going to wind up with about $5,000 each. And I mean, this is simple mathematics. Sit down and you tell me what is $5,000 going to do to a guy with a $2,000 a month mortgage payment? Kids in school, kids going to college, or not going to college, but freaking just buying them shoes and clothes and keeping, $5,000 literally gets you nothing in today's life. You might be able to have, if you're single, you don't have a family, you might be able to take a good vacation, buy a crappy used car. I mean, what are a couple of fights in the UFC worth? But if they should have been, say, making, I go back to the example of I think his name was Rob Hammock or something along those lines, and he was a Canadian fighter. He's related to Cajun Johnson's camp. Cajun fought in that group with us at Bodog for a little bit. And I'm not sure if he's still with them anymore. I heard Cajun's actually living in Vegas also and things like that. But this was back in the 2007 era. And this was other fighters in this group were Bill Mahood, a good, reasonable level of fighters. And these guys were Canadians. And I got sat down in my Bodog office And they came to us and they said, look, we want to work with you here, but we want to give you some information. And this is a number now that's more than 15 years old. But they said that by their calculations with training and nutrition and this and that and the other stuff, the fighters probably need to make between 60,000 was the number that they floated per fight. Not 30 and 30, because if you lose, you got the 30, but you still got the expenses and the other 30 and stuff. But you've got managers, you've got other expenses that go into that the fighters have to cover in order to get to the fight. And 60,000 was the number there. So, if you're starting a fighter at, start with that number from that long ago. The guys getting $5,000 in the second part of the lawsuit reasonably should be getting 10 times more than that. Get them to 50. Here's a check for 50 per fight, right? So if you fought 3 times, that should get you 150. Maybe in the settlement or whatever, you should get 120. I'm not going with the 60 number. I'm going with less. But again, in today's world, $5,000 is an insult. And it's a spit in the face of the guys that even if they went into the octagon once and got clobbered and never fought again, they still were on pay-per-view. They were still part of a show that was pulling in intense amounts of money for a company that makes a ton of money. So, yeah, the judge is not wrong that the settlement is not enough, I don't think.
Now, behind the scenes, how much of the talk between UFC and Trump, obviously they bring him out a lot of their events. Do you think they're counting on him to maybe save them down the line from this? I don't know how long the trial could take, but I know the appeals would work well after the election, I would think.
Yeah, look, it's always good to have friends in high places and stuff. But, I don't think Trump, as president of the United States, you would think that he's going to have, if he wins, obviously, but he's going to have things that are more important to worry about than this settlement and helping Dana out. There, like I said, I believe that the proper thing to do would be to let an investigation go on there. And, maybe he could decide to not authorize it or authorize it or be involved in that. That in itself could be controversial. But and I'm not an expert by any means on American politics. I haven't lived there in almost 2 decades, right? But I also look at the example of Trump with the Jeffrey Epstein situation, where he'd been on the plane, but he's pretty comfortable that, he may have visited once or, been with him or met him or whatever, but he's not really one of the big names that's implicated in the illegal stuff, right? The kids and other types of things. Trump's name hasn't been dirty like Bill Clinton's, for example. Not in that situation. And there was a spot where I see Trump very much saying, hey, if there was something wrong there, it should come out. And he might take that same opinion with I like Dana, but if they did something wrong, let justice be justice. So I don't know. I don't know, but yeah, they bring him out. Like I said, having a friend in a high place like that, and he likes the fighters. But I think now you're talking about another subject that we've talked about is Trump's that type of personality. He likes to shake hands with the fighters, and the fighters, he sees them as men. He's a man. He fights. He got shot. And what was the word that came out of his mouth? Fight. I've seen some recent videos of old clips of his where he says never quit. So I think that there is a psychological connection there. And but he's always going to be a fight fan. But I don't know that stepping in here would be a good political move for him, because it is lower level stuff. It's just some guys, in a sport that it's a sport. It's entertainment. It's fun. It's something that not a lot of presidents get involved in. Making in the old days, I think that a lot of the like I think baseball was the first one with these, that has some power within the government because they were the first big sport, and the president of the United States may have become involved in that stuff, but you see it less and less. It's a different game. So, yeah, hopefully the judge is able to get the resources. I think Trump is smart enough, from what I can tell, that he would say, if something wrong happened there, we should find out about it. Because that's just a blanket statement that's good for a politician to say. Not, this is my friend, let me cover him, or, let me pardon Dana, or, that's an exaggeration, I think, but you get what I mean. It's like, I'm stepping in to help guys that are billionaires like that, just based on friendships and things like that. I'm not sure that's a good political move for anybody.
Now I'm gonna give you a chance here to get your crystal ball, which is right here. I want you to get it out and Mystic Miguel's crystal ball. And what do you think happens here? Does it go to trial, or do you think UFC coughs up more money?
I think the judge is creating a chance for the right things to happen. But I don't know what that is. I think that the UFC could very well come back and say, look, here's a lot more money. Let's just leave it like that. And then that would actually eliminate a lot of the concerns that the judge, that you mentioned, the judge noticed.
I don't know if money would just do it, though, because he has concerns about the contractual stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's one of those things where, if they go to trial, he may be able to enact in that. But I think that the UFC is going to be drawing a line there. If that is Fitch and many of the other people, their behavior is not such that they're going to want to budge on that. They're going to have to be forced to change those contracts, I think. And how that happens, if he says, okay, well, even $2 billion to divide up among the fighters, isn't enough. We're going to go to trial with this. He can force that. But then, again, with money, if you take the guys getting $3,000 and $5,000 settlements in the current settlement and gave them 10 times more money as a minimum, you're going to have a lot less unhappy people, or a lot more unhappy people that the settlement is being extended and not being given out right now. 50,000 does make more of a difference than 3 or 5,000.
Right.
And again, a lot of those guys, how many can we be talking about? If we're talking about 50,000 a fight, and you take the settlement of 300 and make it 3 billion. I believe that's 10 times, right? That's 10 times more. So if you go one fight, you're getting $5,000 on the check. Now it's 50. That makes a little bit of a difference. That's a down payment on a house. That's taking a couple $100 out of your month, your mortgage payment. If you apply it towards what you've got left or whatever. So for some people, these guys are older. For some people, it may help them pay off their house or get a car or contribute to their kids' college education or whatever is going on with that. So I think money at the end, and at the end of the day, I think the judge would have to wonder if he wouldn't be doing more harm than good for people who may really need the money. So I don't know. I don't know how, without going to trial, they're going to be forced. I think they draw the line right there. It's like, well, we'll pay 10 times more, but we're not going to change our business practices. And forcing them to change their business practices was supposedly always one of the goals, right? But
well, that's what they were in violation for, was a lot of their business practices.
But here's the thing is the minute they threw $300 million out, which we all agree, from me to you to the judge, is not enough money, they caved in and took the money.
But maybe they did it strategically.
Like the fighters, everybody was like, all right, well, the money, it's settled. And it's the judge saying, hold on a minute.
Right, but remember, we talked about that. We said maybe they thought, they're not dumb, these lawyers. They might have thought, look, we'll show that we're negotiating in good faith, that we're trying to play along with this. The judge made them do this, negotiate, and they might have known, look, the judge isn't going to go for this. Let's just hang out. We're going to get more
It could be
money
a
out of
higher
them.
strategy. You're absolutely right. We talked about that. I think you were the one that pointed out that there could be some type of
Based
legal
on his
strategy.
behavior previously. Yeah.
So yeah, let the judge be the bad guy. And or I don't know how, the judge is also, I wonder at what level of detail the UFC guys talk about this stuff in boardrooms, what their legal teams are doing now. I think they behave differently than under the Fertitas and Dana, where it was more, mafia-like, you know what I
Right.
mean? But it's like, were these lawyers ever approached or ever pressured on the other side? That would be a big problem, right? So if the UFC wanted to or tried to, this would give them a good situation where the lawyers say, hey, look, we don't want you coming after us. It's the judge's fault on this. It's a tough call, and I don't know that we'll know, except for if a big federal investigation were to start and you start going through emails, and this would be perfect evidence of, maybe the judge was approached at some point and didn't like the approach. So he's going to give the UFC trouble when maybe he just, like I said, is acting ethically, sees what we see, which is that this company does do things that look like a monopoly, and that he wants to do a good job. What I don't know is, if they force it to go to trial, would Maisie and his legal team be the ones still doing the defense, or would there be some type of upgrade to lawyers, different type of, I don't mean upgrade like Maisie did a bad job or anything, but I think trial is going to be very demanding on resources. And then there's appeals and things like that. And you talk about guys that are going to be extended on money. So is there going to be some type of enhanced legal team that works on the fighter's side? And I don't know how that gets done other than, like I said, the feds in some way, shape, or form doing the investigation.
Yeah, it's going to be real interesting to see. And for people watching this, the judge is going to rule sometime this week, I believe, because those tweets from Josh Groats were 3 days ago. So it should be pretty interesting to see what we find out, because this could be just a massive content space in the future.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see how it plays out. I saw Dana. I'm not sure how old the video was, and it was a clip also, but he was on a private plane on his way to Saudi Arabia, with, one of those private planes with maybe 3 other passengers in it. And he was just an inane tweet where he said, oh, I got this guy back here that ate half everything on the plane, and I got this other guy here that ate the other half. So he was claiming to have no food on the plane for the long flight to Saudi Arabia. So just a, normal social media interaction for him, where he's, keeping himself out there. But again, he's on a private plane on his way to Saudi Arabia. He's not changing his business practices. The fact is that whole strategy could be their way out, because if they start fighting and doing a lot more activities in a lot of other countries and things like that, the reach of this judge becomes less and less. In fact, I think we saw that they declared, again, what will a federal investigation look like? Will they just look at emails and shows and finances in the United States, because they became an international company? Shows in Japan, shows in London, Sweden, Germany. They've done. Can they get to the finances of those shows? because again, Brazil and all those places, the thought to me is in some of those places, they might be even able to, especially, and we've theorized about this too, especially if there was some kind of proof that they're acting as a house or as a gambling outlet for big time gamblers. Because, the $20 million Connor gate, you take a couple of $10 million bets on that on the side and take house money for it and cover it. That's another couple of $1,000,000 that they're going to be making. That wouldn't have to be declared. That wouldn't have to do anything. And as they're doing it overseas and things like that, it's a company that has had tentacles everywhere. And every one of those tentacles was turned into a way for them to make money. So we've had podcasts where we've suspected that, like, for example, the show that was recently in China with the Chinese girls in one of the co-mains, there was probably some heavy betting on those, and the casinos in China, probably took bets. They could go out on the internet and copy, Bodog's lines on the fights and just cut and paste them there. But maybe they paid some type of fee to the UFC for help in creating the lines. And again, those fees wouldn't be, they're going to take a few $1,000,000 in bets. That's more money that the UFC could have coming in from an activity that nobody even thinks or sees. It's just speculation, but they did start out as casino owners.
Yeah. I want to give you a chance, as we're wrapping this up, I want to give you a chance to talk about MMA Collector. I know you've been kind of under the weather, but things you have going on there, and also the dog rescue we always close with.
Well, I'm MMA Collector. We do got to start sparking up the recordings again. I have taken a little bit of time off with being sick and a couple other activities. The dog rescue. I'm sad because when I started working with them, the very first dog I met there was a little dog named Whiskey that they used to bring along, and he was the first test dog. So if you're bringing in a new dog or whatever, he had the right personality to not fight and this, that, and he was the very, very first test dog, and he just had to be put to sleep. Age caught up to him and stuff, and it's been sad because we lost, one of the truly good-natured animals that I ran into when I first started doing this. And he was always happy to see me and good personality and things. So that made me sad. And that's another one of the reasons why I haven't been recording as much with the collector right now, is that I a few trips to the vet with him and this, that, the other thing. And then, the decision was made to put him down. So that's what's going on. But life goes on. He's in a better place, I think. Better than we are.
Well, as always, Miguel, you always do a great job with this stuff. And we encourage people to check out MMA Collector 74. That is what we were talking about. Subscribe there. Miguel's doing a lot of great historical content. Subscribe to this channel. Check out our memberships that made cheap memberships for everybody. And we appreciate the support, and just making more content. We're gonna have more stuff for you. I did something on Incident Knowing and Frank Shamrock. I was wanting to do it with Miguel, but he had been kind of busy. But that's some stuff we can do some more of. There's a lot of classic fights out there. Yeah,
definitely good stuff.
That was one of my favorite fights, and there's a lot of great fights like that outside the UFC and stuff that we can do more of. And
for sure.
Yeah, we appreciate the support. And as always, until the next episode, take care.
Hola, soy Litzy La Bomba Dilene, boxeadora profesional de México, y estás viendo el show de Todd Atkins, en donde verás y escucharás a grandes talentos del boxeo. No te lo puedes perder.